Hey everybody, welcome back to Josh's Smart Home. This is the fifth video in a series of how to build out your easy and powerful smart home. In this video, I'm super excited. This is one of my favorite topics. So we already talked about how to decide which devices you want to get and how to set them up and get them installed. And now is the fun part. It's automation time. So we're going to talk about how to set up scenes and automations, which are also known as routines. So let's get to it. Welcome back to Josh's Smart Home. If you're new here, I've been building out my smart home for almost 10 years now, and I want to share with you what I've learned along the way to make your home smarter. To understand the difference between scenes and automations, I have a couple of examples for you. One, I'm standing in a movie theater, and you wouldn't want to have to adjust every light. And if you have windows, close the blinds or, turn on all the different devices. You'd want all that to happen in the same manner every time you're going to watch a movie. So in that instance, you would have a scene. Another example of a scene would be when it's time for bed. You want to have certain lights that turn off, maybe certain doors that lock, an alarm system that turns on, and you don't really want to go in and have to do something for each of these devices to occur. So that scene would be the bedtime scene. And to really add a lot of power to the scenes, you can pair them with automations. So our automations are situations where you have something that occurs and it causes something else to happen. So it would be automated in that fashion. A very basic example of this would be if you would have a motion sensor and then turn on a light. So you'd have a motion, that would trigger the light. And it's pretty easy to think of it that way. Another example could be if you give a voice command, it can initiate a scene. So if you're going to bed, maybe you tell your voice assistant, "Hey, I'm going to bed," and then it can initiate that bedtime scene that you set up. All of the major systems that we talked about, the voice assistants being Alexa, Google, and the Apple HomeKit, as well as the Home Assistant and the Samsung SmartThings, all support scenes and automations. Although you have Alexa that calls the automations routines. So don't know what you're doing there, Amazon. Stick with automations, it's much more clear. Now that you know any of the platforms can support the scenes and automations, let's talk a little more about scenes. So, scenes are really a collection of smart devices that all react simultaneously to the setting of that scene. And I'm going to give another example here. Maybe we're talking about like a good morning scene, and that would be a situation where you'd have it set up that you could either do it with your voice assistant or set at a certain time, where maybe the blinds open up halfway, the lights in the kitchen, turn on dimly. Maybe the lights in the bathroom turn on so you can go in and brush your teeth and get ready in the morning. Maybe you hear information like the weather for the day or the news, whatever it is you would like, or maybe your smart speaker. So you can have all those things really happening all at once. And that would be an example of a scene for the good morning scene. And setting it up like this would prevent you from saying, "Hey," whatever voice assistant you want to utilize, set the blinds to 50% and set the bathroom lights to 5%, set the kitchen lights to 10%, tell me the news, tell me the weather. It's a whole lot of things that really can just happen simultaneously with one simple command or one simple trigger. And don't worry about triggers or commands. We're going to talk about those a little bit more once we get into the automations and the different pieces of the automation. Another great example of a scene could be when you leave the house. So maybe you have a situation where when you leave the house, all of the lights turn off and the doors lock and the security alarm, turns on and makes sure the garage doors are locked. It changes the temperature in the house to a more appropriate, away temperature and just sets everything just how you'd like it. So that's a good example of, goodbye scene or a leaving scene. And that can be triggered with, different devices or different methods, but I have a really good method to utilize as we talk about the automations. Now, without further ado, let's jump into the automations, or as some platforms call them, as I stated, routines. And here we're going to talk about a couple of different things. We're going to talk about triggers. That would be what, really gets the automation started. We're going to talk about conditions, which some platforms offer, and that's a way to limit when things happen, even if a trigger is, set off. And then we're going to talk about the actual actions that are going to happen. So what happens when something's triggered and certain conditions are met. So we're going to talk about all that as we continue the video, but don't forget to like and subscribe. I really appreciate it. It really helps my channel and helps me to provide additional information to you free of charge. So what are some examples of triggers that you might want to use? Well, you could use a time-based trigger. So maybe you have, Monday to Friday, you get up at a certain time for work. Maybe you get up at 4:30 in the morning and you want something to react at that time, or you get up a little bit later and you want it to react at the time you get up. So time is a good one. Sunset and sunrise, that's a good one when you're talking about lights. So maybe, you want to have them set to where they come on when the sun sets, but that changes throughout the year. So you want to have, the sun's time rather than, the clock time to utilize for that. It may be when a device is, triggered. So maybe it's when open door close sensor, opens. So you open up the front door and something happens, or the garage door opens and something happens. There's a motion sensor and that can trigger something. Maybe it's a smart device, so the washer dryer complete, and that triggers something to occur. There's a lot of options out there when you're thinking about triggers. But the one trigger that I mentioned earlier about when you leave, that's called geofencing. So that would be utilizing a device such as a smartphone and using its location to determine when you are or are not home. So we have a certain boundary set up around our house. So once we go outside that boundary, it assumes that we left the house, and then it can trigger the, goodbye or away scene that we have set up. And vice versa, if you're coming home and you get in that boundary, it can trigger, an arrival scene. Maybe it turns off the security system and it opens a garage door based on who comes home, things like that. So there's a lot of options there. We also, during, the holiday seasons, when that comes up, we have the Christmas trees only on when we're home because they're not visible from the outside. So it makes a lot of sense to know when, people are home or not, so that you can react on that information. Another great example is the thermostat. You can save a lot of money by utilizing the geofencing to know when people are present or not. So you don't have to have any guesswork in there. You don't have to, commit to a certain time or a certain schedule. You can actually track whether or not anybody's home and utilize that in your automations. And I'm going to skip over conditions here for just a minute as we talk about the actions first. And that's because it's not available in all the platforms, and it is maybe a slightly more advanced technique, but it's a super important one for automating your home. So we're going to talk about the actual actions, and those are some of the examples that I was just using regarding, changing the thermostat, opening the garage door. Maybe when your washer dryer are done, you make announcements. That's what we do at our house. When you have motion sensors, you can do a lot of things with that. I have a video I'm going to link up here, talks about how we have our house set up where in the hallways and the basement area, the common areas, we don't have to touch the light switches. Everything reacts to our presence there and our movements, and it always lights up the current room and the next room. So that's a really good video if you want to get more information about, how do you set that up and how would you do that on a larger scale, because we have a lot of light switches that we have automated with motion sensors. And now to the conditions. This is where you can have a really, really powerful smart home. And that's because you can have multiple things impact whether or not something occurs. So that may sound a little confusing. So let me explain here. For example, we have our washer and dryer that we know, they're smart, so we know when they're complete. And I'd mentioned that we, have a Google announce those in a lot of rooms. Well, one of the things we do is we restrict that based on time of day. So if, somebody decides to do laundry overnight and it, finishes at 2 a.m., we don't have announcements all over the house because that would just be chaotic and wouldn't make any sense. So we have set boundaries on things. Maybe it's based on who's at the house, what happens and where it gets announced. Maybe it's based on who's at the house, whether certain things, are triggered or not, because we may expect that if I'm home, something different happens than, for example, if my wife's home. A good example of this would be checking for the arrival. So I'd mentioned that when we come home, it opens up the garage door. So my son's is pretty straightforward. We have 3 garage doors. He always uses the same one. But my wife and I, we switch cars. So it's pretty hard to tell based on phone, cell phone alone, who's arriving, which door to open. So what we have it do is we have it check the Tesla and determine based on conditions there, is it in drive, that type of thing, is it, moving? And if it is, then we open the Tesla door. And if not, then it must be the van that arrived home. We open that door. So we have the trigger being that one of our cell phones arrived home, and then the condition being that the Tesla's in drive to actually open the Tesla door. And in this instance, we could have some if statements. So we can have it actually go down. And this is where we really get all the power of Home Assistant and even Smart Things to an extent here as well. But Home Assistant opens up all the possibilities where we can go in and do another if statement where we say, if the Tesla's in drive, open the Tesla door, otherwise open the van door. Maybe we have a situation where we have conditions. For example, I have some automation on our swimming pool, and it checks to see whether or not the swimming pool filter and chlorinator ran enough for that day. And if it did, it turns it off. So it checks it, every 15 minutes overnight. And I think throughout the day as well. It's been a while since I set up that automation, but depending on what the criteria is, when it's checking the time, it'll actually act different. So it'll utilize some of those conditions. And I've done that through a counting method. So it keeps track within Home Assistant of how many 15-minute increments the filter and the chlorinator have run, so that we make sure that we have it running the exact amount of time we need it each day. So now that you have the general idea of automations and scenes, and then within automations, the conditions as well as the triggers and the actions, we're going to talk about how to do this efficiently and effectively in your smart home. And the first thing is you want to just start with a simple introduction of automation in your home. So just start with one thing and keep it simple. Maybe, you tell your voice assistant that, it's good morning or something along those lines, and you trigger just a couple of devices, or you have it set up where at this time of the day, a light turns on, and then at this time, overnight, it turns back off, whatever that may be. But keep it simple at first and get comfortable with setting up an automation. Next, think about what you do in a normal day. Do you always turn out certain lights when it's time for bed? Always locking the doors, checking the garage doors, making sure they're closed, maybe changing the thermostat? Then maybe you're looking at a bedtime routine there and setting that up in a scene and then having it triggered from the automation. Maybe when you get home from work, you want certain music playing. So maybe you have a welcome home routine that would trigger when you enter, the geofencing area, and you come, after that, maybe you open up the door and then it triggers, and it only does that during certain times of the day so that it's when you come home from work. So there's another example of something you might do in your daily life. And this next one is super important for anyone else living at your house. And that's considering conditions and exceptions. There is no worse way to destroy the WAF, the wife acceptance factor, than to have something go haywire in the middle of the night, and maybe, your washer's done and your routine for the washer being done is to flash the lights in the bedroom and make a Google announcement. You do that at 2 a.m. and your wife's not going to be happy, or whoever you're living with won't be happy, as that's going off. And furthermore, you're probably not going to be happy. What you want your home to be when you automate it is exactly what you need. Nothing annoying, nothing extra. And you might think, well, a lot of this seems to be extra. No, it's what we need to happen when we're doing a certain thing. So I could hit the light switches, or I could ask Google, but it's much better to have a lot of these things automated. I found myself when I travel, especially for work, I was traveling a lot at one point, and I would walk into the bathroom in the hotel room, and I wouldn't even think about turning on the light switches. I was just so used to everything happening for me. The same with the fan. We have automation in our bathroom that looks at the humidity and the lights and the motion to determine when the exhaust fan should be on, or not. So all those things just happening make life much more convenient. You don't have to worry about, did I forget to close the garage door? Because you have an automation set up that once you leave that geofenced area, it can close automatically if no one else is home. All kinds of options there, and it just makes your life simpler. The automations are really cool because they can save you time and money, but make sure you think about those exceptions and conditions where you don't want that particular automation to run, and make sure you have that condition set up there. Next is a pretty easy thing and something that anybody that, works with, new processes or new procedures is pretty familiar with, and that's test, test, and test. You want to make sure you test it out. You can start by, just running the automation when in the apps, testing it that way, and then trying to trigger it and making sure that it triggers when it should. And more importantly, sometimes is it doesn't trigger when it shouldn't, because you don't want that, like we just mentioned. You'd probably be pretty surprised to know that in 3 of our rooms in our house, a couple of walk-in closets, as well as the pantry, the smart light with the motion isn't really smart at all. It's just one of those dumb, motion sensor light switches that go right into the old light, replace the old light switch, and there's no intelligence. It's not connected to the smart home. But the reason for that is sometimes less is more. If that's all you're looking to do and you just want to trigger one light on or off, and the light switch location already has a good view of that room, there's no reason to make it more complicated. Keep it simple where it's appropriate, and spend the time and money automating where it makes a lot of sense for you. And the final tip for the scenes and routines, or automations, if you will, is to make sure you go back and regularly review what's going on in your home. Delete the things you don't need anymore. Maybe you had something that broke, or something you don't use, or you just didn't like it. Don't compete against the automation. Just get rid of the automation. You can usually pause or disable the automations so that you don't have to worry about them running. And if you wanted to use it again in the future, or use something similar to it, you'd still have it saved there. So make sure you're going back and reviewing. I like to do it every couple of months. I just glance through everything. I try to organize them by name. So I may have like timer set up if it's based on time, or sunset or sunrise, so that I have all those automations together, and it makes it much easier to review those. By mastering scenes and automations, you're not just controlling devices, you're orchestrating experiences, and that's how you make your smart home work the way you need it to. What are your favorite scenes or automations? Let me know in the comments section below. I love to hear about what you're doing in your smart home. Sometimes I get an inspiration, or I may want to share it with others, because you have a lot of great ideas and I appreciate them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.